Imagine a lottery, but not the kind where you win a giant check. I'm talking about a genetic lottery, a roll of the biological dice that happens right at the moment of conception.
Completely random.
Completely random, totally invisible, and for one in every few thousand women across the globe, that roll comes up, missing a piece.
Specifically, a missing piece of an X chromosome. It's a tiny, tiny change in the code, but it just changes the entire trajectory of a life.
Exactly. And, usually when we talk about genetic conditions, you expect a conversation about, well, biology, cells, DNA, that kind of thing.
Which we will get to. But today is a little different because the research we're looking at, this massive 2025 study from Acta Obstetricia at Gynecologica Scandinavica, it paints a much bigger picture. It suggests that while the genetics might be random, the experience of living with this condition is almost entirely dictated by where you are on the map.
That is the part that hooked me. We're looking at the geography of genetics. The study is called Global Burden and Between Country Inequalities and Turner Syndrome from 1990 to 2021.
Right. It's by Long and Hu and their team.
And they just crunched 30 years of data to figure out not just how many people have this, but who gets found, who gets treated, and who stays invisible.
And this is the first comprehensive analysis using the Global Burden of Disease database for Turner syndrome. Their goal was really ambitious. Move beyond the clinical definition and actually understand its global footprint.
So before we start sticking pins in the map, we should probably understand the territory. For anyone who might have just heard of Turner syndrome in passing, maybe in a high school bio class, let's do a quick refresher. What's actually happening?
Okay, so let's go back to biology for a second. Typically, females have two X chromosomes. You can think of them as backup systems for each other. They carry all these crucial instructions.
Right, so you have two copies of the manual. If a page is ripped in one, you can just read it from the other.
That is a perfect analogy. In Turner syndrome, or TS, one of those copies is either completely gone or it's partially deleted. The backup is gone. And because the X chromosome has instructions for so many different things, not just reproductive stuff, the impact is systemic. It's all over the body.
The source material lists a whole laundry list of impacts. Short stature seems to be the one everyone knows.
That's the hallmark, yeah. Almost universally, untreated women with TS will be significantly shorter than their genetic potential would suggest. But that's just what you see on the surface.
Right.
Underneath, you have things like ovarian dysgenesis, which usually means infertility, no spontaneous puberty. You have congenital heart defects, and those are the most dangerous part, potential kidney issues.
So it's not just being short, it's a whole multi-system medical challenge.
Exactly. And it affects roughly, say, 25 to 50 out of every 100,000 females. It's not incredibly common, but it's not super rare either. It's right in that zone where it needs a lot of medical attention.
Okay, so that's the biology. Now let's get into the global snapshot from this study. They looked at data from 1990 all the way to 2021. When they zoomed out, what are the headline numbers? How many people are we talking about?
As of 2021, the estimated global prevalent cases, so the number of people living with the condition, was just over 500,000. About 531,784.
Wow. Over 500,000 women and girls.
Correct. And in that same year, 2021, there were about 24,000 new cases diagnosed, the incidence. But here's the trend that really jumps out from the data.
Okay.
Between 1990 and 2021, the total number of people living with TS went up by 27.7%.
That sounds like a big spike, almost a 30% jump. Is the condition? Is it becoming more common? Is something causing more chromosomal errors?
That's the first question everyone asks. But the study did something called a decomposition analysis to figure out the why. They wanted to see what the driver was.
And it wasn't genetics.
It wasn't genetics. The mutation isn't happening more often.
So the dice aren't rolling differently.
No. The age standardized rates, so the rate per person, stayed almost completely flat. The huge increase is driven by one thing, pure population growth.
Ah, okay. Simple math. More people on the planet just means more rolls of the dice.
Exactly. Yeah. The escalator of humanity is just going up. In fact, the analysis showed that population growth alone added over 116,000 cases. If the population had stayed the same, we wouldn't see this jump.
That makes sense. But was anything pushing the numbers down at all?
Yeah, there were some counterforces. Population aging and what they call epidemiological changes.
Yeah.
Basically better health care. They actually did work to reduce the prevalence a little bit.
But not enough.
Not enough. The sheer force of population growth just overpowered everything else. It's like trying to swim against a really strong current.
So the wave of humanity gets bigger, and it drags the case numbers up with it. Okay, now here is where it gets really interesting for me. The study broke it down by country. This is the whole geography of diagnosis. If I asked you where most of these women live, what does the data say?
Well, if we're talking absolute numbers, just the
Mm.
raw count of patients, it pretty much mirrors the world's population centers.
Okay.
The highest numbers are in India with about 92,600 cases, then China with roughly 57,000, and the United States is third with around 42,000.
So big countries, big numbers, that tracks. If you have a billion people, you're going to have more of everything.
Precisely.
Yeah.
But here is the twist. If you look at the prevalence rate, the number of cases per 100,000 people, the map changes completely.
Who comes out on top then?
New Zealand, the USA, and Belgium. New Zealand is at the top of the list with about 32 cases per 100,000.
Wait, hold on. Why? Is there some genetic reason for that in New Zealand? Why would their rate be so much higher than India's?
It's highly, highly unlikely to be genetic. This is almost certainly a reflection of the healthcare system.
Oh,
High prevalence rates in wealthy countries like New Zealand or the US, they reflect two things: better survival rates and, this is the key, better diagnostic capacity.
I see. So the women in New Zealand are being counted because they're being found.
Exactly. To be prevalent in a database, two things have to happen. One, you have to be identified by the medical system, and two, you have to survive.
And in a lot of the developing
A
world,
baby born with the severe heart defects common in TS might just pass away in infancy.
and without a genetic test, the cause of death is recorded as, I don't know, heart failure.
Exactly. Or a girl might grow up just thinking she's naturally short and infertile, and she never gets the test to confirm why, so she never enters the data.
So in a way, the map of high prevalence isn't a map of where the disease is, it's a map of where the doctors are.
That's a profound way to look at it, and I think it's right. And we see the inverse, too. The lowest numbers were in places like No and Tokelau. Now, part of that's just tiny populations, but it also reflects limited diagnostics.
The study also mentioned some big regional shifts. It said Western Sub-Saharan Africa saw a huge jump.
A massive jump, 142% increase in prevalence. Again, that's driven mostly by the population boom in that region. But you contrast that with Eastern Europe, which actually saw a decrease of about 21%.
A decrease. Is that just because the population is shrinking there?
Partly a population decline, yeah. But it also hints at something else we need to talk about, which is prenatal screening. And that brings us to the inequality gap.
Right. This is the part of the study I really had to read a couple of times. They use this term SDI, Socio-Demographic Index. Basically, a way of ranking how developed a country is. And I'm seeing something that looks like a contradiction.
You've spotted the paradox.
It feels backwards. The data says that wealthy regions, places like Western Europe, North America, they have the highest prevalence, the most women living with Turner syndrome.
Correct.
But then it says the incidence, the number of new babies being born with it, is actually higher in low-income developing regions. How can you have more babies born with it but fewer people living with it?
It's a heavy realization when you put it together, isn't it? It points to two completely different realities. Let's start with the wealthy world. Why is incidence dropping there?
I'm guessing medical intervention.
Prenatal screening. In high SDI countries, non-invasive prenatal testing is becoming standard, a simple blood test from the mother. If a fetus is flagged for Turner syndrome, families have a choice. And many opt for elective termination, so the birth rate of the condition drops.
Okay, that explains lower incidence in, say, the UK or US, but they still have high prevalence.
Because if you are born with TS in a wealthy country, the healthcare system catches you. You get the heart surgery, you get growth hormones, estrogen therapy. You survive, and you live a long life. So the pool of people with it stays large.
And in the low SDI regions, the data says incidence is rising.
Rising because the population is booming. More people, more genetic dice rolls. But there's very little prenatal screening, so the babies are born.
But they aren't showing up in the living with it numbers.
Which brings us to this concept. Sociologists call it missing women.
They aren't in the data because they aren't surviving.
Or they're just never identified. If a baby is born in rural Niger with a common heart defect from TS, and there's no pediatric cardiac surgeon for 500 miles, that child likely dies in infancy. The diagnosis dies with them.
Wow, it just highlights that biology is only half the story. The other half is about resources.
It connects right to this efficiency gap analysis they did. They used a method called frontier analysis.
Now, this part I loved. It sounds like something out of science fiction, but it's really just a way of grading countries on their homework.
That's a good way to think about it. It's an efficiency score. They asked, given how much money and resources a country has, how well are they managing the burden of this disease?
And I assume the wealthy countries got an A+N. I mean, if you have the budget, you have the efficiency.
You would think so. But the data says no. And this was a real shocker in the paper. Countries like New Zealand, Belgium, and the USA showed large efficiency gaps.
Wait, how? We just said they're great at diagnostics, at keeping people alive. How can they be inefficient?
Because burden in this study isn't just about death. It includes years lived with disability, or YLDs.
Okay.
In wealthy countries, women are surviving, which is great.
Uh-huh.
But they are living with significant health challenges that aren't being managed well.
So survival isn't the only metric for success.
Exactly. Women are surviving into their 40s, 50s, 60s, but they're dealing with untreated infertility, autoimmune issues, hearing loss, psychosocial struggles. The efficiency gap means that even though the system saved their lives, it's failing to manage their quality of life.
It's like buying a Ferrari and then never changing the oil. You've got the high-performance machine, but you aren't maintaining it.
That's a perfect analogy. The study suggests these wealthy systems are good at acute care, fix the heart, fix the height, but terrible at the long game.
And what about the low-SDI countries? What about their efficiency gaps?
The study showed countries like Niger and Somalia had very small gaps. They looked efficient.
But that can't be right. We just said they have almost no healthcare access for this.
It's a data illusion. And the researchers are very clear about this. When you have massive underreporting, massive underdiagnosis, the burden in the data looks artificially low.
Right. You can't have a disability burden on paper if the patients aren't even in the system.
Exactly. So they look efficient simply because all the suffering is invisible to the database.
That is a stark reminder that data always needs context. You can't just look at a chart and say Somalia is handling this better than Belgium.
No, absolutely not. It tells us that what we define as success has to be different depending on where you are.
Let's pivot to the timeline of a patient's life, because the when of diagnosis seems just as important as the where. The study mentions the median age of diagnosis is 15.
15. Think about that. That means half of all girls with TS aren't finding out until they're teenagers.
That feels incredibly late. I mean, surely you'd notice the growth issues before then.
You'd think so. But often if a girl is just short, it gets dismissed. Oh, she's a late bloomer, or her parents are short. The diagnosis often only happens when puberty just doesn't start.
And why is age 15 a problem? What's the difference between catching it then versus at age 5?
Well, by 15, the growth plates in the bones are already fusing. It's often too late for growth hormone therapy to make a big difference for final height. And more importantly, you've missed 15 years of screening for heart defects or kidney issues.
So the later the diagnosis, the worse the outcome.
Statistically, yes. Diagnosis after age 12 is linked to poorer long-term outcomes.
The study mentioned 3 peaks of diagnosis. When are we finding these cases?
So the first peak is prenatal, or at birth. Those are usually the more severe cases with visible signs, like a webbed neck. The second peak is that 5 to 20 age range, triggered by height or puberty issues. And the third peak is surprisingly late, ages 30 to 40.
30 to 40, how? Why then?
Usually infertility. A woman tries to conceive, can't, goes to a specialist, and only then discovers she has Turner syndrome. Imagine going 3 decades without knowing this fundamental fact about your own genetics.
That must be a massive psychological shift. Here is the reason for everything.
It is, and it speaks to the changing nature of the burden. The study found that globally, the burden of the disease peaks in kids under 5. That's mostly in the developing world, where those early years are a fight for survival.
But in the wealthy world,
In high SDI regions, the burden peaks in young adulthood, ages 20 to 34. Survival is high, so the challenge shifts. It becomes about managing the long-term stuff. Fertility, cardiovascular monitoring, the higher risk of diabetes.
this connects directly to that loss to follow-up issue the authors bring up.
Yeah.
This part really frustrated me. We spend all this effort diagnosing them as kids, and then what? We just say, good luck.
Essentially, yes. Picture a girl with TS. She's 16. She sees a pediatric endocrinologist every 6 months. She's measured, she's monitored, she's in the safety net.
Okay.
Then she turns 18.
Mm-hmm.
She graduates high school. She graduates from her pediatrician. Now she has to find an adult specialist. But maybe she feels fine. She's done with growth hormone shots. She just wants to be a normal young woman.
So she stops going to the doctor.
She falls right off the cliff. And the problem is the silent killers, the high blood pressure, the aortic dilation, they don't stop because she turned 18. The study highlights this transition from pediatric to adult care as the single biggest point of failure in high-income countries.
That just seems like such a fixable problem.
It is. The authors explicitly call for transition clinics, bridges between the two worlds. Because right now, we are saving these girls as children only to lose them to preventable issues as adults.
It really hammers home that healthcare means something totally different depending on the context. In one place, it's just getting a basic genetic test, and in another, it's a transition clinic for young adults.
And in both places, it's about seeing the patient as a whole person, not just a list of symptoms.
So let's look forward. The study projects out to 2050. What does the future look like?
Well, the numbers are going to keep climbing. They used a forecasting model, and they predict absolute prevalence will reach about 541,000 cases by 2050.
But incidence new cases, that's expected to drop a little bit.
A modest decline, yeah, from about 24,000 down to maybe 14,600. And that's assuming the current trends in prenatal screening and family planning continue.
So we'll have fewer babies born with it, but a larger population of adults living with it.
Exactly. The population of people with TS will get older, the age standardized rates will decline a bit, but the absolute burden on healthcare systems is not going away.
So what's the takeaway for policymakers? If you were sitting across from the World Health Organization with this study, what are you telling them?
I'm telling them that a one-size-fits-all strategy is useless. For the low-SDI countries, especially in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, the priority has to be basic diagnostic infrastructure. You can't treat what you don't find.
And for the high SDI countries?
The focus has to shift to quality of life. We need to close that efficiency gap. It's not enough to have the fancy technology. We need organized, lifelong care strategies. We have to stop losing women in that transition to adulthood.
It's a call for a much more nuanced approach. You know, what sticks with me most from this whole thing is that invisibility aspect. We have data for the 531,000 women we know about, but that efficiency gap, the low prevalence in developing nations, it's a bit haunting.
It creates a ghost population in the data.
Exactly. And that's the thought I want to leave our listener with. We know incidence is higher in low-income countries, but prevalence is reported as lower. That gap represents real human lives. How many thousands of women are out there right now in rural India or Nigeria, struggling with infertility, struggling with fatigue, living with Turner syndrome, without ever knowing the name for the thing that defines so much of their reality?
It's a profound question. And until we close that diagnostic gap, their stories just remain untold.
A huge thank you to the researchers Long and Hugh for this incredible work, and thanks to you for walking us through it.
My pleasure.
And to our listener, thanks for taking the deep dive with us. We'll see you on the next one. Stay curious.